Okay, good afternoon, Veritas scientists. This is our lesson for today, Tuesday, April 14th, 2020. We are learning about coal formation, which I find extremely interesting. So I think you're all going to learn something new today, which I'm excited to talk about. So before we do that, let's quickly go over 2 vocabulary words. Then I got myself a cool drawing I did on the back to try to teach you about how coal is formed and about some of the problems that we have on our Earth because of the way that big companies are getting coal from the ground. All right, so we'll talk about that. So stay tuned. Here we go. Number 1, the vocabulary is coal. It's a sedimentary rock, which we've learned about how those are formed. It's a sedimentary rock that formed from large swamps that existed about 318 million years ago. Coal is useful to people because it easily lights on fire and can be used as fuel. Okay, so coal is made mostly of carbon. Okay, it's not all carbon, but it is mostly made out of carbon, which we're going to get to in a little bit. Okay, and that makes it able to light on fire very easily. Okay, number 2 are fossil fuel. So a fossil fuel is any combustible organic material. Combustible means that it lights on fire. So let me just say that quickly. So it's combustible, so any fuel that is combustible, it's organic material, which we've learned before. Organic matter are things that used to be alive. So at one point, that's why it's a little different than the other rocks we've been learning about, because those were inorganic. They were never, ever alive. Coal is an organic material. It was at one point alive, okay? So let's rewind. Fossil fuel, any combustible organic material such as coal, oil, and natural gas that was formed from the remains of former life. When a fossil fuel runs out, people can't make more of it because it takes hundreds of millions of years to form. So that is a major problem. When we run out of fossil fuels, they are gone for the rest of our lives and for many, many generations behind us because they take hundreds of millions of years to form. So if we use all of these fossil fuels, if we use all the coal, for example, we won't ever have it again for hundreds of millions of years, which is a really, really long time. All right, so these are so important because if we use all the coal, the oil, and the natural gas, they will be gone forever. And that's something that we cannot have happen. All right, so let's go to the back. This is how coal was formed. So here's my drawing. I'm not the best artist, but I did my best. Okay, so I got like 3 pictures here showing you kind of a timeline. So this first picture was about 300 million years ago. Now, I want to remind everybody that the dinosaurs died 6 million years ago. So the dinosaurs went extinct 6 million years ago. So we're talking about a time long before the dinosaurs. Okay, so I should probably add that to my picture here. Long before dinosaurs. So we're talking about a really long time ago. 300 million years ago. Okay, so in North America, that's where we live. On North America, well, first of all, the ocean level was higher around the whole world. So on North America, specifically, there were tons of giant swamps. Okay, so the water was higher, so there was more water inland, and there were these massive swamps. So if you picture like Florida, the bayou down there in Louisiana, these giant swamps, there's a place called, look up the Okefenokee Swamp. Something like this, Okefenokee Swamp. It's in Florida, and I think it is in Georgia and maybe even Louisiana. It's in a few different states. If you look this up, that's kind of what it looked like in North America 300 million years ago. It was a giant, giant swampland, okay? So all of these plants, these giant plants, they all died, all right? So now we're going to look at 100 million years ago. So 200 million years go by, and now we're at 100 million years ago from today. Okay, so these giant swamps, everything died. So for whatever reason, they didn't have enough sunlight maybe. Whatever happened that caused all of these plants to die, they all died, right? So these swamps, everything living in these giant swamps died. So that's where these plants ended up here in my model, okay? So you have the ground underneath it, then you have this giant space of dead plants from all these old swamps, okay? And then on top of that is some dirt and some rocks, and on top of that is water. And there are some they're like dinosaurs are around at this point. These are like old sharks and things that lived in the water, okay? So we learned about how sedimentary rocks are formed. So the sediment's going to fall to the bottom of this water. It's going to harden over time, and it's going to form rock. So the rock is going to form on top of this giant layer of dead plants from these swamps that died, okay? So that giant layer of dead plants is creating a chemical called peat, P-E-A-T. So peat is being formed as these dead plants decompose, and they're down deep under the earth at this point. Okay, so this stuff called peat is forming here where the dead plants are. Okay, peat eventually turns into coal, okay, over millions of years. So those dead plants eventually, now we're going to move to today, present day, 2020, the dead plants, after millions of years, right, they've been sitting underground for 300 million years at this point, that peat has now turned into coal. So the coal was formed from dead plants from these giant swamps that existed 300 million years ago. So now you have this strip, S-T-R-I-P, strip of coal. Okay, it forms in strips like this, like in a layer. You'll have this giant strip, and all of it is coal because that's where all those dead plants had all died at around the same time. Okay, so you have this coal, and then on top of that is rocks and dirt, and on top of that are the trees, and there's me, and there's Charlie, right, the dog. So deep down under the ground now is coal, okay? So that's how the coal was formed. Another reason I brought up the Okefenokee Swamp is because today, present day, 2020, they are finding peat in the Okefenokee Swamp. So that means 300 million years from now, there will be more coal formed in areas like the Okefenokee Swamp down in Florida and Georgia and Louisiana and places like that where there's lots of swampland. All right, so I think that's cool because hundreds of millions of years from now, it's going to take a long time, but there will be some more coal on this earth many, many, many years from now. Okay, so everybody gets it? Swamps all died for some reason. All those dead plants at the same spot ended up having dirt pile up on top of them, rocks formed from this body of water that was on top of them. Now you got rocks and dirt on top of these strips of coal. So coal is formed in big strips. All right, so let me just take a deep breath. There's a place called the Appalachian Mountains in the United States. The Appalachian Mountains are down in Virginia, and we're going to talk specifically about West Virginia. Okay? So there is a lot of coal mining that happens down in West Virginia, okay, in these Appalachian Mountains. So here's a picture of a mountain down in Appalachia is what they kind of call that area, but it's in the state of West Virginia. Okay? So like we said, coal forms in strips. So in this mountain, there's a strip of coal. It's not at the top because on top of that coal, the way it was formed was all the heat and pressure pushing down on these dead plants, and that heat and pressure turned it into coal. So on top of the coal, there are dirts and there is dirt, there are rocks, and that's what caused the coal to form from these dead plants, right? Heat, pressure on it turned it into coal. So in the middle somewhere, you have a strip of coal in this mountain. So what they do down in Appalachia is they do something called mountaintop removal. Okay? So before the big companies learned that this was possible, that coal formed in these strips like this, and that if you found some coal, that means you have a giant strip of coal, and you can get all of this coal, right? So what they used to have people do is they used to have miners go into mines, they dig holes, and they would have people going into the mountain and bringing out the coal one bucket at a time, right? Working really hard. It's dangerous, right? The roof could collapse at any point. People were dying. If there were any chemicals or gases being released in this mountain from underground and you breathe that in, workers were dying, companies didn't make as much money because it was very expensive to have to pay all these people to go in and mine out all the coal that was there and then bring it to a factory, right? There were lots and lots of costs in order to use a mine like this, like they used to do, right? So these big companies down in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, they said, we're going to do something called Mountaintop Removal. That'll be cheaper for my company, and our company will make more money. So what they did was they dug some TNT into this mountain, and guess what they did? Kaboom! They blew it up. And this still actually is going on today. So kaboom! They blow that top of the mountain off. Now it is gone. It's gone. And where they left off is now this flat top of the mountain. Now the top of the mountain is here. And they just dig out all the coal. They don't have to go in any mines. It's right there on the top because they just blew the top of that mountain off. And then they dig out the coal and problem solved, right? They got all this coal. It was a lot cheaper for them. And to them, they say, ooh, nice, we win. So then they go to the next mountain and guess what they do? Oh, here's the coal. Kaboom. Blow it up. We'll dig out our coal. We'll get our coal. No problem. Go to the next mountain. Where's the coal? There it is. Okay, let's blow the top of the mountain off. Let's dig up the coal, and we'll get the coal out, right? So imagine this happening in all the mountains around in West Virginia, down in these Appalachians. So now you're left with these areas with mountains that used to be there that are now gone. So any plants and animals and trees that used to live there are dead. Same thing on all of these. And you end up with these barren tops of these mountains, okay? I want you to think about this question. Based on what you learned about coal and mountaintop removal, what effects does it have on the surrounding ecosystem? So the fact that these mountains are no longer there, the tops are blown off to get out the coal, what effect is that going to have on the surrounding ecosystem? And I want you to give at least 2 negative effects in your response. So 2 bad effects that it's going to have on the ecosystem, okay? But I'm not done with talking. I just want to make sure I didn't run out of time. Okay, so I want you guys to think about something. So people down in West Virginia, they're not very educated. No offense to the people down in West Virginia. They're not very educated. They're not very wealthy. They're mostly poor, uneducated people that are living in these areas where the mountains are being blown up. The tops are being removed, right? So you have big groups of people who are mostly poor for reasons that are not necessarily their fault, and they are not educated, so they're not able to speak up for themselves. So all these mountains in this area are being destroyed. There are lots of negative effects that are happening to the ecosystem, but the people that live there aren't able to speak up for themselves. They're not educated enough to find who should I go to make sure that they stop doing this to our area, right, our land. They can't speak up against these giant companies because the companies have too much money and too much power, and the people living in the Appalachian Mountains do not have very much power, and it's really, really not fair. So what happened is these companies came in and they have destroyed so many of these beautiful mountains in order to get the coal, in order to make more money, and then they leave the people there with basically ecosystems that are starting to fall apart for some reasons I'd like you to think about afterwards. Okay, so pretty interesting how coal was formed, right? But it's really a big problem that they're doing this to our earth in order to get the coal out. So that's something I wanted you guys to be aware of. And it's important for us because that's why it's so important that we get educated, so that if there are issues in our places where we live, we're able to speak up against them. We're able to go to the right people to say, this is not right. You shouldn't be doing this to our earth, right? But in a place like this, they're not able to do that for themselves. So it's so important to be able to have that power of education so that if things like this were to happen, that we're able to speak up against it, and we're able to fight against it, and we're able to make better choices as a community, right?